There's nothing quite like losing everything you ever loved to make a man question why he keeps drawing breath. When grief takes hold, it has a way of making the world feel empty, like walking through rooms where laughter used to live. Old Eli Boone knows this feeling all too well. 2 winters back, he buried his wife Sarah, and soon after, his boy ran off to work the railroads without saying goodbye. Now folks say Eli's lost his mind, living alone in Montana's mountains, talking to ghosts and carving wooden crosses. But when he finds a bear cub whose mother was killed by hunters, something changes. The other trappers laugh at him for taking the creature in. They warn him that bear will be his death. What happens when a broken man finds something worth protecting again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat like a weathered prayer against the mountainside, its log walls darkened by decades of Montana winters and summer storms. Smoke curled lazy from the stone chimney, carrying the scent of pine and old memories into the thin mountain air. Eli Boone moved through his morning ritual with the precision of a man who'd done these same tasks for 37 years, though now each motion carried the weight of solitude. He pulled on his worn leather boots. Sarah had mended the left one 3 times before she passed, and stepped onto the porch that creaked familiar greetings under his feet. The wooden cross he'd carved yesterday sat propped against the rail, joining a dozen others in various stages of completion. His calloused hands had shaped them all in the long evenings when the silence grew too heavy, when the absence of Sarah's humming threatened to crush what remained of his spirit. The wedding ring on his weathered finger caught the morning light as he picked up another piece of pine. He'd worn the gold band smooth with constant turning, a nervous habit that started the day they lowered Sarah into the frozen ground. 2 winters ago, when the fever took her despite his desperate prayers and all of Doc Morrison's medicines. The ring had been her grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of women who'd loved mountain men. Now it seemed to mock him with its weight, a golden reminder of promises he'd failed to keep. Till death do us part, he whispered to the morning mist, his voice hoarse from disuse. But you went first, darling. You left me here with all these empty rooms. The Bitterroot Range stretched endlessly before him, peaks crowned with snow that never fully melted, valleys thick with lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. This land had been their sanctuary, a place where they built their dreams stick by stick, stone by stone. Sarah had planted wildflowers along the cabin's south side, lupine and Indian paintbrush that still bloomed each spring, though no one remained to tend them properly. Their son Thomas had been born in the back bedroom during a blizzard so fierce the midwife couldn't make it up the mountain. Eli had delivered the boy himself, following Sarah's calm instructions while the wind howled like something wild and hungry. 23 years later, Thomas had walked away from it all, heading for the railroad camps in Missoula without so much as a backward glance. "There's nothing here for me, Pa," the boy had said, his mother's green eyes flashing with determination. Anne heard nothing but ghosts and empty promises. The world's changing, and you're too stubborn to see it. Eli understood now what Thomas meant. The old ways were dying, the careful knowledge passed from father to son, the respect for the mountains, moods and seasons, the understanding that a man took only what he needed and left the rest for tomorrow. The younger generation wanted easier lives, steady wages, electric lights, and indoor plumbing. They saw the mountain as backward, primitive, something to escape rather than protect. But Sarah had understood. She'd seen the beauty in simple things. The way morning mist danced through the pines, how the creek sang different songs in spring and autumn, the satisfaction of preserving summer's bounty for winter's lean months. Her hands had been steady on the butter churn, gentle with injured animals, fierce when protecting what she loved. The other trappers still visited occasionally, though less frequently now that Sarah's coffee and warm bread no longer drew them to the cabin. They'd gather around the pot-bellied stove, sharing news from town and discussing trap lines, fur prices, and weather patterns. But their conversations had grown stilted since Sarah's passing, filled with awkward silences and careful avoidance of anything that might remind Eli of his loss. Jake Morrison came by most often, though their friendship had grown strained. Jake had been Thomas's age when he'd started trapping with Eli, learning the trade from a master who'd learned from his own father before him. Now Jake talked constantly about opportunities in town, about modern methods and new markets. He'd married a schoolteacher from Missoula and built a house with electric lights and a telephone. His wife wore store-bought dresses and spoke of civilization as if the mountains were some kind of purgatory to be endured rather than embraced. "You can't live up here alone forever, Eli," Jake would say, his voice carrying the forced patience of a man talking to someone he considered simple-minded. "Sarah wouldn't want you wasting away like this. There's good work in town, steady income. Oh, the railroad's always looking for experienced men." But Eli knew Sarah would understand his need to stay. This cabin held their entire life together. The laughter echoing from the kitchen where she'd taught him to make proper biscuits. The quiet evenings when she'd read aloud while he whittled by lamplight. The fierce storms they'd weathered together, wrapped in quilts her mother had sewn. Every log, every stone, every worn floorboard held memories too precious to abandon. The morning he'd found the bear cub had started like any other. He'd been checking his trap line along Willow Creek, following a path he'd walked for decades. The snow crunched under his boots, and his breath formed white clouds in the bitter air. He'd been thinking about Sarah, as he did most mornings, remembering how she'd insist he wear his wool scarf. Even though he'd grumbled, it made him look like an old woman. The first sign of trouble had been the ravens. Too many of them circling and calling with unusual urgency. Ravens were intelligent creatures, and Eli had learned to read their signals over the years. Their agitation meant death, fresh and violent. He'd followed their calls to a clearing where the snow was stained dark with blood. The female grizzly lay crumpled against a fallen log, her massive body riddled with bullet holes. She'd been a magnificent creature, probably weighing close to 400 pounds, her coat thick and healthy despite the harsh winter. Someone had killed her not for meat or defense, but for sport, the kind of wasteful killing that made Eli's stomach turn. The cub had been huddled against its mother's still form, mewing pitifully and nuzzling the cold fur as if trying to wake her. It couldn't have been more than 3 months old, still dependent on its mother's milk and protection. Without intervention, it would die within days, either from starvation or predators. Eli had knelt in the bloody snow, studying the tiny creature that would determine his fate. The cub's eyes were dark and intelligent, filled with fear and confusion, but not yet the wild mistrust that would make rescue impossible. Its fur was the color of rich honey, marked with the darker guard hairs that would eventually give it the grizzled appearance of its kind. "What am I supposed to do with you, little one? What am I supposed to do with you? What am I supposed to do with you, little one?" He'd whispered, surprised by the roughness in his voice. He hadn't spoken aloud in days. The cub had looked up at him with an expression that seemed almost human in its desperate need. Something in that gaze had cracked open a part of Eli's heart he'd thought permanently frozen. For the first time since Sarah's death, he'd felt the stirring of purpose, the recognition that something in this world needed him to survive. He'd wrapped the cub in his wool coat and carried it home through the deepening snow. The little creature had whimpered against his chest, its tiny claws digging through his flannel shirt. By the time they reached the cabin, both man and bear were shivering, though from cold or emotion, Eli couldn't say. That first night had been the longest in recent memory. The cub had refused the cow's milk he'd tried to feed it, mewing constantly and searching for its mother. Eli had sat up by the fire, holding the small body against his chest, feeling the rapid heartbeat gradually slow as exhaustion finally claimed. The orphaned creature. "You're going to be more trouble than you're worth," he'd murmured into the soft fur. "But I reckon we're both lost souls looking for a reason to keep going." The next morning had brought Jake Morrison to his door, stamping snow from his boots and calling out his usual greeting. Jake's expression had shifted from concern to bewilderment when he'd spotted the cub sleeping in a nest of blankets by the fire. "Sweet Jesus, Eli, what in hell have you done?" Jake had asked, his voice rising with disbelief. "That's a grizzly cub. You know what happens when the mother comes looking for it." "Mother's dead," Eli had replied simply. "Shot full of holes by some fool with more bullets than sense." Jake had studied the sleeping cub with the wariness of a man who'd seen what adult grizzlies could do to careless humans. "Even so, Eli, this ain't a pet dog. That thing will grow up to be 600 pounds of claws and teeth. It'll turn on you sure as winter follows fall." But Eli had already made his decision. Something about the cub's helpless dependence had awakened. Instincts he'd thought buried with Thomas's childhood. The protective urge that had driven him to provide for his family, to stand between them and the world's dangers, had found new purpose. "Maybe it will," he'd said, settling back in his chair, with the sleeping cub cradled against his chest. "But right now, it needs someone to keep it alive. I reckon that someone might as well be me." Jake had shaken his head with the exasperation of a man watching a friend make a terrible mistake. "You're grieving, Eli. I understand that. But this isn't the answer. Sarah wouldn't want you risking your life for some wild animal." The mention of Sarah had stiffened Eli's spine. Jake meant well, but he hadn't known Sarah the way Eli had. She'd been the one nursing injured birds back to health, the one who'd fed every stray cat that wandered up the mountain. She believed that caring for helpless creatures was part of what made humans worthy of their dominion over the earth. Sarah would understand, Eli had said with quiet finality. She'd probably already have that cub in a warm basket with milk heating on the stove. As winter had deepened, the other trappers had come to call, drawn by curiosity and concern. They'd gathered around Eli's fire, drinking his coffee and studying the growing cub with a mixture of fascination and fear. The conversations always turned to warnings and predictions of doom. "That bear's going to be your death, you old fool," Sam Fletcher had declared, pointing at the cub with the stem of his pipe. "Mark my words. Soon as it gets big enough, it'll remember it's a wild animal and tear you apart." "Maybe so," Eli had replied, watching the cub wrestle playfully with a piece of rope. "But till then, we'll keep each other company." The cub had grown quickly on a diet of milk and honey, supplemented with fish from the creek and whatever game Eli could provide. Its personality had emerged gradually curious and intelligent, with a mischievous streak that reminded Eli painfully of Thomas at the same age. The little bear had claimed the space by the fire as its own territory, though it followed Eli everywhere during the day. Learning to trust the gentle hands that fed and protected it, Eli had named it Hope, though he'd kept that fact to himself. The other trappers would have mocked such sentimentality, but the name felt right. This small creature had given him something to focus on beyond his grief, a reason to plan for tomorrow instead of dwelling in yesterday's losses. Now, as spring began to touch the high country, Hope had grown large enough to venture outside with confidence. The cub's presence had changed the rhythm of Eli's days, filling the silence with soft chuffs and contented rumbles. For the first time since Sarah's death, the cabin felt alive again, inhabited by something more than memories and regret. The wedding ring still caught the morning light on his finger, but its weight had become less burdensome. Sarah's voice seemed to whisper approval in the mountain wind, and the wooden crosses he carved each evening had begun to change from symbols of grief to expressions of gratitude for the unexpected blessing that had wandered into his broken life. The maucous spring morning when everything changed started with Hope's excited chuffing from the cabin's front porch. The cub, now weighing close to 60 pounds and standing knee-high to Eli, had developed an uncanny ability to sense approaching visitors long before they came into view. Her large, rounded ears would perk forward, and she'd emit the soft vocalizations that had become as familiar to Eli as his own heartbeat. "What is it, girl?" Eli asked, setting down his coffee cup and moving to the window. Through the morning mist rising from the valley, he could make out 3 riders picking their way up the mountain trail. The lead horse carried a man in a dark, suit-and-usual attire for these parts, where practical clothing meant the difference between comfort and misery. Hope pressed against Eli's leg, a behavior she developed when uncertain about strangers. Her intelligence continually surprised him. Unlike a dog's blind trust or a cat's aloof independence, Hope seemed to evaluate each new situation with careful consideration, as if weighing threats and opportunities with the wisdom of a much older creature. The riders reached the clearing. As Eli stepped onto his porch, Hope remaining close but alert, the man in the suit dismounted with the careful movements of someone unaccustomed to horseback travel. His companions, hard-faced men with the look of hired muscle, remained mounted, their hands resting casually near their weapons. "Mr. Boone?" The suited man called out, his voice carrying the crisp authority of city education. "My name is Harrison Caldwell, representing the Northern Mountain Fur Syndicate. I believe we have business to discuss." Eli kept his expression neutral, though. Something cold settled in his stomach. He'd heard whispers about the syndicate from other trappers, a large operation buying up territory and trapping rights throughout the territory. They brought modern methods and business practices to an industry that had operated on handshakes and mutual respect for generations. "Don't recall sending for any business discussions," Eli replied, his hand finding Hope's thick fur. The cub's presence steadied him, reminding him that he wasn't entirely alone on this mountain. Caldwell smiled, but the expression held no warmth. He was a lean man with pale eyes and carefully groomed whiskers, the kind of person who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. He pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebags and approached the porch with confident steps. "Every successful business reaches out to identify opportunities," Caldwell said. "We're expanding our operations into this valley, and we'd like to make you an offer for your trapping rights and your property." The blood-stained contract he withdrew bore an official seal and elegant script. Eli didn't need to read the details to understand its implications. The syndicate wasn't making polite inquiries. They were serving notice of their intentions. "This mountain isn't for sale," Eli said simply. "Been in my family for 3 generations. My daddy built this cabin with his own hands, and his daddy before him trapped these valleys when they were still wild country." "Mr. Boone." Caldwell's tone carried the patience of a man explaining simple concepts to a slow child. "The fur trade is changing. Individual trappers working small territories can't compete with organized operations using modern techniques. We're offering you a fair price, more than fair, considering the remote location and limited access." He quoted a figure that would have been generous for town property, substantial enough to buy a comfortable house and steady income. 2 years ago, when grief clouded his judgment and purpose seemed lost, Eli might have considered such an offer. But Hope's warm presence against his leg reminded him that some things couldn't be measured in dollars. "Still not interested?" Eli replied. "This land means more to me than money ever could." The 2 mounted men exchanged glances, and Eli caught the subtle signals of professionals assessing a potential problem. Their hands had shifted closer to their weapons, and their horses seemed to sense the growing tension. Caldwell's pleasant mask slipped slightly. "Mr. Boone, I don't think you understand the full situation. We've already acquired exclusive trapping rights to most of this valley. Operating independently will become increasingly difficult, dangerous, even." "Is that a threat?" Eli's voice carried the quiet steel of a man who'd faced down charging grizzlies and survived mountain winters that killed weaker souls. "It's a business reality," Caldwell replied, though his pale eyes had turned cold. "The old ways are dying. You can either adapt or be left behind." Hope sensed the shift in atmosphere and pressed closer to Eli, her dark eyes fixed on the strangers with unmistakable suspicion. At 4 months old, she already showed the protective instincts that would make her formidable as an adult. Her presence seemed to unnerve Caldwell, who kept glancing nervously at the growing cub. "Interesting pet," Caldwell observed, his tone carefully neutral. "Rather unusual choice for a companion." "She's not a pet," Eli corrected. "She's family." "Dangerous." "Family," one of the mounted men spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a distinct accent. "Grizzlies kill more men than any other animal in these mountains." Eli studied the speaker, a lean man with scars along his jaw and the cold eyes of someone comfortable with violence. "Professional killers, both of them. The syndicate hadn't sent negotiators. They'd send enforcers. Only if you threaten what they're protecting," Eli replied evenly. "Hope you're as gentle as a lamb with folks who treat her respectful." The irony wasn't lost on him. The other trappers had warned him repeatedly that the bear would be his death. Yet here she stood, his most loyal defender against men who radiated genuine menace. Caldwell folded the contract and returned it to his portfolio with deliberate precision. "Mr. Boone, I'll give you time to reconsider our generous offer, but I should mention that we've already begun operations in the valley. Independent trappers may find their traditional grounds compromised." The euphemism carried obvious implications. The syndicate would destroy his traps, frighten away game, and make it impossible for him to earn a living through traditional methods. They'd done their research and knew that an isolated mountain man had few options for legal recourse. "You'll find me a stubborn old fool," Eli said. "Been accused of worse things and survived." As the 3 men prepared to leave, the scarred enforcer fixed his gaze on Hope with unmistakable intent. "That bear's going to cause problems. Wild animals belong in the wild or dead." The threat hung in the mountain air like smoke from a bad fire. Eli felt Hope tense against his leg, her natural instincts recognizing predators regardless of their human form. In that moment, he understood that the syndicate's interest went beyond simple business acquisition. They viewed anything outside their control as obstacles to be removed. "Gentlemen," Eli said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd never backed down from necessary fights, "you're welcome to leave my mountain the same way you came up it, healthy and breathing. But if you come back with threats against me or mine, you might find the descent considerably more challenging." Caldwell mounted his horse with visible irritation. The negotiation had not proceeded according to his expectations, and men like him didn't handle unexpected complications gracefully. 2 weeks, Mr. Boone," he called out as they rode away. 2 weeks to think about our offer. After that, the price drops considerably along with our patience." Eli watched them disappear down the mountain trail, their horses' hoofbeats fading into the morning stillness. Hope remained pressed against his side, her intelligent eyes tracking the strangers until they vanished from sight. "Well, girl," Eli said, scratching behind her ears, "looks like we've made some powerful enemies. But you know what? I'm tired of being afraid. Tired of letting bullies take whatever they want." The cub looked up at him with those dark, trusting eyes, and Eli felt something stir in his chest that had been dormant since Thomas left the fierce protectiveness of a man defending his family. The syndicate had made a crucial miscalculation. They'd threatened not just his property or his livelihood, but the one creature that had given him reason to keep living. As he stood on his porch, watching the morning mist clear from the valley below, Eli Boone began planning not for surrender, but for war. The old mountain man might be past his prime, but he wasn't finished yet. And beside him stood a growing grizzly who'd already proven that loyalty ran deeper than species. The blood-stained contract in Caldwell's portfolio represented more than a business transaction. It was a declaration that the old ways had no place in the new world. But some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. Some bonds were stronger than fear. The hand-carved feeding bottle had been one of Eli's first attempts at domestic ingenuity after bringing Hope home. Hollowed from a large gourd and fitted with a makeshift nipple fashioned from soft leather, it represented his fumbling transition from grieving widower to surrogate parent. Now, months later, Hope had outgrown the need for such contraptions, but Eli kept the bottle on the kitchen shelf as a reminder of how far they'd both traveled. "Come on, girl," Eli called from the cabin's back door, watching Hope investigate a patch of early spring flowers with the intense curiosity that characterized her every waking moment. Time to learn something useful. At 5 months old, Hope had developed into a magnificent creature, her honey-colored coat thick and lustrous, her movements gaining the fluid grace that would eventually make her a formidable predator. But for now, she remained endearingly clumsy, her oversized paws occasionally tangling as she bounded through the underbrush. Like an overgrown puppy, Eli led her to the creek where he'd been teaching her to fish, a skill that would prove essential. As she matured, the lesson reminded him painfully of similar sessions with Thomas decades earlier, when his son had been eager to learn every aspect of mountain life. Those memories carried both sweetness and sorrow, but Hope's presence somehow made them bearable again. "Watch the water," Eli instructed, settling onto a fallen log beside the creek. "See how it moves different where the fish are feeding?" Hope cocked her large head, studying the water with the serious concentration she brought to all new experiences. Her intelligence continued to amaze Eli. She seemed to understand not just his words, but his intentions, responding to subtle changes in his tone and body, language with uncanny accuracy. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their lesson. Martha Henderson emerged from the tree line, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. At 62, Martha remained a handsome woman, her silver hair braided practically, and her weathered hands still capable of any task the mountain demanded. She'd been Sarah's closest friend, and since the funeral, she'd taken upon herself the job of ensuring Eli didn't waste away from neglect or stubbornness. "Morning, Eli," she called, dismounting with the easy grace of someone who'd spent her entire life on horseback. "Brought you some things from town: coffee, flour, and that salted pork you favor." Hope approached Martha with the careful politeness she'd learned to show trusted visitors. The bear had developed a remarkable ability to distinguish between friends and potential threats, accepting gentle attention from people like Martha while maintaining wariness around strangers. "Appreciate it, Martha," Eli said, rising to help unload her supplies. "But you don't need to keep mothering me. I'm managing fine." Martha fixed him with the look she'd once used on her own children when they attempted obvious falsehoods. "Managing, perhaps, but not thriving. Sarah would box my ears if I let you turn into some wild hermit." The mention of Sarah no longer struck Eli like a physical blow, though it still carried weight. Martha had been present for the best and worst. Moments of his marriage, celebrating Thomas's birth, mourning Sarah's death, and everything significant that had happened between those milestones. "Besides," Martha continued, scratching Hope behind the ears, "I wanted to check on this young lady. She's grown considerably since my last visit." Hope leaned into the attention with obvious pleasure, her contentment evident in the soft rumbling sounds that served as her version of purring. The cub had developed distinct relationships with different people, showing playful affection with Martha, respectful caution with Jake Morrison, and complete trust only with Eli. "She's learning fast," Eli said with obvious pride. "Fishing, foraging, even some basic commands. Smart as any creature I've ever known." Martha studied the growing bear with experienced eyes. She'd lived her entire life surrounded by wildlife, understanding both their beauty and their dangers. She's bonded to you strong, Eli. But have you thought about what happens when she reaches full size? Grizzlies aren't meant to live as pets. The question had haunted Eli during sleepless nights, though he'd avoided examining it too closely. Hope would eventually weigh 500 or 600 pounds, possess claws capable of shredding a man, and carry instincts shaped by millions of years of evolution. Yet, when he looked at her now, rolling playfully in the grass while keeping one eye on his location, she seemed as harmless as any domestic animal. She's not a pet, Eli said, the words carrying familiar weight. She's family, and family doesn't abandon each other just because times get difficult. Martha's expression softened with understanding. She'd known Eli long enough to recognize the depth of his attachment to the orphan cub, and wise enough to realize that arguments would only strengthen his resolve. "Jake Morrison stopped by my place yesterday," she said, changing the subject. With deliberate casualness. "Mentioned you'd had some visitors from town. Business types asking about your property." Eli's jaw tightened at the memory of Caldwell and his enforcers. The past week had passed quietly, but the syndicate's deadline loomed like storm clouds on the horizon. It caught signs of men watching his cabin from a distance, broken twigs, disturbed earth, the feeling of eyes upon him when he worked his trap lines. "Nothing I can't handle," he replied, though both he and Martha knew the situation was more complex than simple stubbornness. Eli, Martha's voice carried the authority of someone who'd raised 5 children and buried 2 husbands. "These aren't local boys looking to buy your winter furs. Jake says they represent some big company with serious money behind them. The kind of people who don't take no for an answer gracefully." Hope seemed to sense the shift in conversation, moving closer to Eli with the protective instincts that had strengthened as she'd grown. Her presence provided comfort, but Martha's concerns reflected a harsh reality. He was one man against an organization with resources and ruthlessness far beyond his ability to match. "They want more than just my trapping rights," Eli admitted. "They want the whole mountain." Made it clear they weren't really asking. Martha's eyes flashed with the fire that had made her formidable during her own struggles to maintain her late husband's ranch. "Then they picked the wrong mountain man to intimidate. Henry always said you were too stubborn to know when you were beat." The compliment carried the weight of shared history. Henry Henderson had been one of Eli's closest friends, a man who'd understood the bond between a person and the land they'd chosen to defend. His death 3 years earlier had left Martha to run the ranch alone, a challenge she'd met with characteristic determination. "Problem is," Eli continued, watching Hope chase a butterfly with single-minded focus, "they didn't just threaten me. They made it clear Hope was part of the problem they intended to solve." Martha's expression hardened. She'd seen enough of life's cruelties to recognize genuine malice when it revealed itself. Then they truly don't understand what they're dealing with. A man defending his family is the most dangerous creature in these mountains. As if summoned by their conversation, Hope returned to Eli's side, pressing against his leg with the trust that had become their unspoken language. Her dark eyes held intelligence and loyalty that transcended species, a bond forged in mutual need and strengthened by shared experience. 2 weeks, Eli said quietly. "That's what they gave me to consider their offer." "And what are you going to tell them?" Martha asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Eli looked down at Hope, then out across the valley that had sheltered his family for 3 generations. The mountain held his wife's grave, his son's childhood, and now his own last chance at redemption through love and protection. "I'm going to tell them that some things aren't for sale at any price," he said. "And if they want this mountain, they'll have to take it from me." Thomas's childhood slingshot hung from a nail in the cabin's rafters, gathering dust like so many other memories. Eli couldn't bear to discard. The leather thong had cracked with age, and the smooth stones Thomas had collected for ammunition remained scattered in a small wooden box beneath his old bed. This morning, as Eli prepared Hope for another lesson in mountain survival, the slingshot seemed to watch him with silent accusation. "Your boy had quite an aim with that thing," Martha had observed during one of her visits, following Eli's gaze to the forgotten weapon. "Brought down more rabbits than seemed possible for someone so young." Now, as Hope grew more confident in her movements, Eli found himself remembering those early days of fatherhood with painful clarity. Thomas had been eager to learn, hanging on every word as Eli taught him to read animal tracks, identify edible plants, and move through the forest without disturbing its natural rhythms. The boy had possessed an intuitive understanding of the mountain's moods, sensing weather changes and animal behavior with uncanny accuracy. "Come here, girl," Eli called to Hope, who was investigating a fallen log with typical thoroughness. "Time you learned about danger." At 6 months old, Hope had reached the awkward adolescent stage that reminded Eli of Thomas at 12, all gangly limbs and boundless energy, curious about everything but lacking the wisdom to distinguish between safe exploration and potentially fatal mistakes. Her weight had doubled again, and her playful swats now carried enough force to knock a grown man off balance. Eli led her to an area where he discovered signs of the syndicate's presence, boot prints in soft earth, cigarette butts carelessly discarded, and the unmistakable scent of men who didn't belong in these mountains. Hope's reaction was immediate and telling. Her entire body tensed, her nose working to analyze the foreign odors, and a low rumble emerged from her chest that Eli had never heard before. "That's right," he murmured, kneeling beside her massive form. "Those scents mean trouble. Remember them." The intelligence in Hope's dark eyes suggested she understood more than simple warning signals. She seemed to grasp that certain humans represented threats not just to herself, but to the safety of their shared territory. Her protective instincts were developing alongside her physical capabilities, creating a formidable combination that even experienced hunters would respect. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their lesson, but Hope's relaxed posture indicated friendly visitors before Eli could identify them. Jake Morrison emerged from the tree line, but he wasn't alone. A stranger rode beside him, a well-dressed man whose nervous glances at Hope suggested he'd heard stories about Eli's unusual companion. "Morning, Eli," Jake called out, dismounting with his usual easy confidence. "Like you to meet someone." Here's Samuel Carter from the territorial government. He's got some questions about recent developments in the valley." Carter dismounted more cautiously, keeping Jake between himself and Hope as if the young bear might charge without warning. His city clothes and soft hands marked him as someone more comfortable with paperwork than wilderness, though his eyes held the shrewd intelligence of a career bureaucrat. "Mr. Boone," Carter began, his voice carrying practiced authority, "I've been hearing concerning reports about conflicts between local trappers and certain business interests. The territorial government takes such matters seriously." Eli studied the newcomer with the wariness of a man who'd learned to distrust official involvement in mountain affairs. Government representatives usually brought regulations, taxes, or other complications that made life more difficult for people trying to live simply. "Haven't had any conflicts worth mentioning," Eli replied carefully. "Just some folks making offers I'm not interested in accepting." Carter pulled a leather portfolio from his saddlebags, his movements watched closely by Hope, who had positioned herself protectively between the strangers and Eli. "The Northern Mountain Fur Syndicate has filed several complaints about interference with their legitimate business operations. They claim you've threatened their representatives and refused to negotiate in good faith." The accusations stung because they twisted reality into something unrecognizable. Eli had threatened no one. He'd simply refused to be intimidated by Caldwell's veiled menaces and obvious attempts at coercion. "Their definition of legitimate business might differ from mine," Eli said. They want to buy my land for less than it's worth, then threatened me when I said no. That doesn't sound like good faith negotiation to me. Jake shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught between loyalty to his old friend and whatever pressure Carter represented. Eli, maybe you should hear what Mr. Carter has to say. The syndicate's got lawyers, official papers, and more money than any of us have ever seen. Money doesn't make right, Eli replied, his hand finding Hope's thick fur. The physical contact with his loyal companion steadied his resolve and reminded him what he was defending. Carter consulted his papers with the deliberate precision of someone building an official record. Mr. Boone, the syndicate has legitimate concerns about safety. Harboring a dangerous wild animal creates liability issues that extend beyond your personal property. The bureaucratic language couldn't disguise the real message. Hope herself had become a target of official scrutiny. Eli felt his temper rising, though he kept his voice level through long practice. Hope isn't dangerous to anyone who treats her respectful, he said. She's well-fed, well-cared for, and more civilized than most humans I've encountered lately. As if responding to the mention of her name, Hope moved closer to Eli, her massive head brushing against his hip in a gesture of affection that would have seemed impossible to anyone who believed the stories about grisly savagery Carter made. Notes in his portfolio, clearly uncomfortable with the bear's proximity, but determined to complete his official business. Nevertheless, territorial regulations require permits for keeping exotic animals. The syndicate has also raised concerns about your compliance with current trapping licenses and land use restrictions. The bureaucratic noose was tightening, Eli realized. The syndicate had done their research, identifying legal pressure points that could force him off his mountain without resorting to direct violence. They understood that government regulations could accomplish what threats and intimidation had failed to achieve. This land has been in my family for 3 generations, Eli said, his voice carrying the weight of inherited responsibility. We've never needed permits to live our own lives on our own property. Times change, Mr. Boone, Carter replied with the detached sympathy of someone delivering unpleasant news for a living. The territorial government has to balance individual rights with community safety and economic development. Jake cleared his throat nervously, clearly uncomfortable with his role in the confrontation. Eli, maybe there's some middle ground here. The syndicate's offering good money, and you could relocate somewhere more suitable for your situation. The suggestion hit Eli like a physical blow. Jake, who'd learned everything he knew about trapping from Eli's patient instruction, was suggesting he abandon the mountain that held his entire life's meaning. This is my home, Eli said quietly. Sarah's buried up on the ridge, and Thomas took his first steps on that front porch. I'm not leaving because some corporation wants to strip the valley bare for profit. Carter closed his portfolio with official finality. Mr. Boone, I'm required to inform you that you have 30 days to comply with territorial regulations regarding exotic animal permits and current land use restrictions. Failure to comply will result in enforcement action. As the 2 men prepared to leave, Hope remained alert and watchful, her instincts clearly identifying them as potential threats despite their civilized appearance. Eli appreciated her judgment. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies wore suits and carried legal documents instead of guns. 30 days, Carter repeated as he mounted his horse. I'd strongly advise you to consider the syndicate's offer before that deadline expires. After they disappeared down the mountain trail, Eli sat heavily on his porch steps, Hope sailing beside him with the comfortable familiarity of long companionship. The legal noose was tightening, but surrender still felt impossible. Well, girl, he said, scratching behind her ears, looks like they're coming at us from all directions now, but we've weathered worse storms than this. Hope's rumbling response suggested agreement, though Eli wondered if his confidence was more bravado than genuine optimism. The antique trapping ledger lay open on Eli's kitchen table, its yellowed pages covered with 3 generations of careful entries. His grandfather's spidery handwriting documented trap locations, weather patterns, and fur prices from the 1840s. His father's steady script continued the record through the territorial period, noting the gradual changes as civilization crept into the wilderness. Eli's own entries filled the recent decades. Though the last year's pages remained largely blank, grief had made such careful record-keeping seem pointless. Now, as summer settled over the mountains, hope had grown large enough to accompany Eli on extended trips into the high country. At 7 months old, she weighed nearly 200 pounds and moved with the fluid grace that marked her as a true apex predator. Yet her loyalty to Eli remained absolute, and her intelligence continued to astound him with each passing day. "Come on, girl," Eli called from the cabin door, shouldering his pack for their morning patrol of the trap lines. "Time to see what the syndicate boys have been up to." Hope bounded to his side with obvious excitement, her massive paws barely making sound on the forest floor. She'd learned to move with the stealth of a natural hunter, though her playful nature occasionally overwhelmed her training. The sight of her approaching would have terrified most people, but Eli saw only his loyal companion, eager for another adventure in their shared territory. The first sign of trouble came at Willow Creek, where Eli discovered his carefully maintained trapline had been systematically destroyed. Every snare had been cut, every deadfall dismantled, and the metal traps had been stolen entirely. The destruction was thorough and deliberate, designed to eliminate months of careful preparation in a single night. Hope sensed his anger before Eli fully realized it himself. She pressed against his leg with the comforting weight of her presence, her dark eyes scanning the area for threats while her nose analyzed the scents left by the intruders. "Syndicate work," Eli muttered, kneeling to examine boot prints in the soft earth. The tracks were fresh, probably made during the previous night when darkness would have concealed the vandalism. "They're trying to starve us out." The economic warfare was more subtle than direct threats, but equally effective. Without functioning trap lines, Eli couldn't harvest the furs that provided his primary income. The syndicate understood that financial pressure might accomplish what intimidation had failed to achieve. They continued up the mountain, discovering similar destruction at every trap site. Decades of accumulated knowledge about animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and optimal placement had been negated in a single night of systematic sabotage. The violation felt deeply personal, as if strangers had invaded his home and destroyed his most precious possessions. At Bear Falls, where the creek tumbled through a narrow canyon, Hope suddenly tensed and issued a warning growl that raised the hair on Eli's neck. Her superior senses had detected something human eyes couldn't perceive, and her protective instincts were responding to genuine danger. "Easy, girl," Eli whispered, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle slung across his shoulder. "What is it?" Hope's attention focused on a rocky outcrop overlooking the trail-perfect position for an ambush. Eli's military training from decades past reasserted itself, and he found cover behind a large boulder. While scanning the area for movement, the attack came from 2 directions simultaneously. Rifle shots echoed through the canyon as bullets struck the rocks around their position, sending stone chips flying like shrapnel. Hope reacted with the speed and ferocity of her wild heritage, charging toward the nearest gunman with a roar that seemed to shake the mountain itself. Eli's return fire was precise and economical, each shot carefully aimed to disable rather than kill. He had no desire to escalate the conflict to lethal levels, but he wouldn't allow himself or Hope to become victims of syndicate violence. The ambush collapsed as quickly as it had begun. Hope's charge scattered the attackers, who apparently hadn't expected to face a fully grown grizzly defending her territory. Their retreat was hasty and undignified, leaving behind dropped equipment and evidence of their presence. "Good girl," Eli called to Hope, who returned to his side with obvious satisfaction. "Reckon they didn't plan on you being part of the equation." Among the abandoned items, Eli found a leather pouch containing papers that made his blood run cold. The documents revealed the syndicate's true intentions. They weren't simply expanding their trapping operations. They planned to clear-cut the entire valley, harvesting timber before establishing a mining operation that would strip the mountains bare. The environmental destruction would be total and irreversible. Generations of careful stewardship would be undone in months of industrial exploitation. The mountain that had sustained Eli's family for decades would become a scarred wasteland, valuable only for the resources that could be extracted and sold. Hope seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, pressing close to Eli as he studied the damning documents. Her presence provided comfort, but also reminded him of what was at stake. If the syndicate succeeded, creatures like Hope would have no place in the transformed landscape. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his thoughts. Jake Morrison emerged from the tree line, but his usual easy confidence was replaced by obvious anxiety. He dismounted carefully, keeping his hands visible and his movements slow. "Eli," Jake called out, his voice carrying strain. "We need to talk." Hope evaluated the familiar visitor with her usual intelligence, recognizing him as someone who belonged in their territory despite his current nervousness. She remained alert but not aggressive, though her position between Jake and Eli made her protective intentions clear. "Heard shooting," Jake continued, studying the scattered evidence of the ambush. "Figured you might be in trouble." Eli replied grimly. But Hope and I convinced them to reconsider their approach. Jake's expression grew more troubled as he examined the abandoned equipment and incriminating documents. "Jesus, Eli, you know what this means? They're not playing games anymore." "Never thought they were," Eli said, folding the papers and securing them in his jacket. "But now I know what they're really after. This isn't about trapping rights or business competition. They want to destroy everything." Jake's loyalty was clearly being tested as he weighed friendship against pragmatic concerns. "Eli, you can't fight an organization with this kind of money and influence. They've got lawyers, politicians, and now apparently gunmen working for them." "Maybe not," Eli admitted, scratching Hope behind the ears. "But I can make them pay." Price they weren't expecting. The documents in his jacket represented more than evidence of criminal activity. They were proof that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. The mountain had sustained his family for 3 generations, and now it was his turn to sustain the mountain. "What are you planning?" Jake asked, though his tone suggested he already feared the answer. Eli looked up at the peaks that had been his home for 63 years, then down at Hope, who watched him with absolute trust and loyalty. "I'm planning to remind them that this old mountain has teeth," he said quietly. "And some of us still know how to use them." Sarah's Bible lay open on the kitchen table, its water-damaged pages swollen and discolored from the night she'd died. The fever had broken just before dawn, and in her delirium, she'd knocked over the water pitcher beside their bed. Eli had been so focused on her labored breathing that he hadn't noticed the spreading puddle until it was too late. Now, 18 months later, the warped pages seemed to mock his neglected faith. Winter's approach had transformed the high country into a landscape of stunning beauty and brutal challenge. Snow dusted the peaks above 10,000 feet, and morning frosts warned of the harsh months ahead. Hope, now 8 months old and weighing close to 300 pounds, had developed the thick winter coat that would sustain her through the bitter mountain cold. "Look at this," Eli murmured, reading from the damaged Bible for the first time since Sarah's funeral. She marked this passage about protecting the innocent and defending the helpless. Hope lay beside the fireplace, her massive form radiating contentment as flames danced across her honey-colored fur. The routine of evening reading had become precious to both of them. Eli's voice providing human companionship, Hope's presence filling the silence that had once threatened to drive him mad with loneliness. The syndicate's escalation had continued throughout the autumn. Supply deliveries to Eli's cabin had been mysteriously delayed or misdirected. His credit at the general store had been questioned due to irregularities in his account. Federal inspectors had appeared without warning, demanding to examine his trapping licenses and land deeds with bureaucratic thoroughness that bordered on harassment. Yet the mountain community had begun to rally around their stubborn neighbor. Martha Henderson arrived weekly with supplies and moral support, her presence reminding Eli that he wasn't completely isolated in his struggle. Other trappers, initially skeptical of his decision to protect Hope, had started bringing information about syndicate activities and offers of assistance. They cut down a whole section of old-growth timber up near Silver Creek, reported Pete Hawkins during one evening visit. Just clear-cut everything, then moved on. Left nothing but stumps. And erosion. The environmental destruction had awakened something fierce in men who'd spent their lives working within nature's rhythms rather than against them. The syndicate's industrial approach to resource extraction violated fundamental principles that had guided mountain communities for generations. Hope had proven invaluable as an early warning system, her superior senses detecting syndicate patrols long before human eyes could spot them. Her intelligence allowed her to distinguish between friendly visitors and potential threats, providing Eli with crucial information about who approached his cabin and what their intentions might be. The evening that changed everything began like any other. Eli was reading aloud from Sarah's Bible, while Hope dozed by the fire, both of them settling into the comfortable routine that had sustained them through the long months of growing conflict. The passage concerned God's protection of the faithful during times of trial, words that seemed particularly relevant to their current circumstances. A soft knock at the cabin door interrupted the reading. Hope's ears perked immediately, but her relaxed posture indicated the visitor posed no immediate threat. Eli opened the door to find Martha standing in the swirling snow, her usual composure replaced by obvious distress. "Eli," she said, stepping inside and shaking snow from her coat, "we need to talk. Something's happened that changes everything." Hope approached Martha with gentle curiosity, sensing the woman's emotional state and offering the comfort of her presence. Despite her formidable size and predatory capabilities, Hope had retained the empathetic nature that made her sensitive to human emotions. "What is it?" Eli asked, settling Martha in his best chair and pouring coffee from the pot that always simmered on his stove. Martha's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the warm cup. "Jake Morrison came to see me this afternoon. He's been working undercover for federal agents, investigating the syndicate's operations." The revelation hit Eli like a physical blow. Jake's recent behavior, his nervous energy, his attempts to convince Eli to negotiate, his knowledge of syndicate activities suddenly made sense in a completely different context. "He's been documenting their illegal practices for months," Martha continued. "The destruction of your trap lines, the intimidation tactics, the environmental violations. But there's more, Eli. Much more." She pulled a sealed envelope from her coat, her expression grave. "The syndicate isn't just interested in this valley. They're part of a larger operation that's been systematically acquiring mountain territory throughout the territory. And they're not planning to stop with logging and mining." Eli opened the envelope with steady hands, though his heart pounded as he read the federal documents inside. The scope of the syndicate's plans was breathtaking in its ambition and terrifying in its implications. They intended to transform the entire Bitterroot Range into an industrial complex, complete with railroads, processing facilities, and company towns. "They want to turn our mountains into another Pittsburgh," Eli said quietly, the papers rustling in his grip. "Factories and smokestacks where there used to be wilderness." Hope seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, moving closer to Eli's chair and resting her massive head against his knee. Her presence provided comfort, but also reminded him of what would be lost if the syndicate succeeded. Creatures like Hope would have no place in their industrialized vision of the future. "There's something else," Martha said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Jake says the syndicate knows about Hope. They've been studying her, taking photographs, documenting her behavior. They're planning to use her as evidence that you're harboring dangerous wildlife." The implications were chilling. Hope's very existence could be twisted into justification for federal intervention, providing legal cover for the syndicate's illegal activities. Her loyalty and intelligence would be portrayed as proof of unnatural behavior that threatened public safety. "When?" Eli asked simply. "Soon," Martha replied. "Jake says federal marshals are already en route, along with syndicate representatives and territorial officials. They're planning a coordinated operation designed to remove both you and Hope from the mountain." Eli closed the Bible and set it carefully aside, his decision crystallizing with the clarity that came during moments of ultimate choice. "Then we'll have to remind them that some things are worth fighting for, regardless of the odds." Hope looked up at him with those dark, intelligent eyes that had become his anchor during the darkest period of his life. The bond between them transcended species, representing something pure and valuable in a world increasingly dominated by greed and exploitation. "They don't understand what they're dealing with," Martha said, studying the massive bear who had become both symbol and catalyst for the approaching conflict. "Hope isn't just your companion, she's become the heart of something larger." Eli nodded, understanding that the struggle had evolved beyond personal survival into something approaching sacred duty. Sarah always said that love means protecting what matters, no matter the cost. As snow continued to fall outside the cabin windows, Eli began planning not for surrender, but for the kind of last stand that would become legend among people who understood that some battles were worth fighting simply because they were right. The hidden mining survey lay buried beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin's back room, wrapped in oilcloth and forgotten for nearly a decade. Eli had discovered it while searching for his father's old surveying equipment, needing precise measurements to plan defensive positions around his property. The document bore official seals and technical diagrams that initially meant nothing to him, but as he studied the detailed geological assessments, a terrible understanding began to dawn. Hope had led him to the discovery in her own mysterious way. 3 days earlier, she'd begun behaving strangely, repeatedly returning to a specific area near the base of Widow's Peak, despite Eli's attempts to direct their walks elsewhere. Her insistence had puzzled him until he'd followed her to a natural cave system he'd never fully explored, hidden behind a tangle of deadfall and overgrown brush. "What is it, girl?" Eli had asked, watching Hope sniff intensely around the cave entrance. "What's got you so interested in this old hole?" The answer had come when he'd crawled into the narrow opening, flashlight in hand, and discovered that the cave system was far more extensive than surface appearances suggested. Tunnels branched in multiple directions, some natural and others bearing the tool marks of deliberate excavation. More disturbing still were the fresh signs of recent human activity survey stakes, equipment caches, and core samples that glittered with metallic traces. Now, studying the mining survey by lamplight, Eli understood why the syndicate was willing to commit federal crimes to acquire his seemingly worthless mountain property. The document detailed mineral deposits worth millions of dollars, veins of silver, copper, and rare earth elements that ran through the mountain like a hidden treasure map. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, his finger tracing the survey lines that corresponded exactly to the cave system Hope had discovered. They've been planning this for years. The implications cascaded through his mind like falling dominoes. The syndicate's aggressive tactics weren't desperate moves by greedy businessmen. They were calculated steps in a long-term strategy to exploit mineral wealth that could reshape the entire territory's economy. His refusal to sell hadn't just frustrated their plans. It had threatened an investment worth more than most people would see in several lifetimes. Hope lay beside his chair, her massive head resting on crossed paws, but her dark eyes remained alert and focused on his face. Her intelligence seemed to extend beyond normal animal cognition, as if she understood that the papers in his hands represented a fundamental threat to their shared existence. The survey also explained her mother's death with heartbreaking clarity. The adult female grizzly hadn't been killed by sport hunters or meat poachers. She'd been eliminated because her territory included the cave entrance that provided access to the richest mineral deposits. Her death had been a calculated business decision, removing a natural guardian whose presence would have complicated mining operations. They killed your mama because she was protecting something she didn't even understand, Eli said softly, reaching out to stroke Hope's thick fur. Just like they're trying to kill us now. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his grim revelations. Hope's ears perked instantly, and her low growl indicated the visitors weren't welcome. Eli quickly secured the mining survey and moved to the window, where he spotted 3 riders approaching through the pre-dawn darkness. Jake Morrison led the group, but his usual easy confidence was replaced by obvious tension. The 2 men with him wore the dark clothing and alert postures of professional operatives, federal agents. Most likely, though their allegiances remained unclear. Eli, Jake called from outside, his voice carrying unusual formality. We need to talk. It's important. Hope positioned herself protectively between the door and Eli's chair, her instincts responding to subtle cues that human senses couldn't detect. Her judgment had proven reliable in the past, and Eli trusted her assessment of potential threats. Come in, Eli replied, though he kept his rifle within easy reach. But move slow and keep your hands visible. Jake entered first, followed by 2 men whose hard faces and careful movements marked them as experienced investigators. The older agent introduced himself as Federal Marshal William Hayes, while his younger partner remained silent and watchful. Mr. Boone, Hayes began, settling into the chair Eli indicated. We're here because we need your help to stop a criminal conspiracy that threatens this entire region. The word conspiracy carried weight that Eli hadn't expected. He'd assumed his conflict with the syndicate was a local business dispute, but Hayes's presence suggested federal crimes of significant magnitude. What kind of conspiracy? Eli asked, though he suspected the answer involved a mining survey hidden beneath his floorboard. Hayes exchanged glances with Jake before continuing. The Northern Mountain Fur Syndicate is a front organization for illegal mining operations throughout the territory. They've been using intimidation, bribery, and violence to acquire mineral rights without proper federal oversight. Jake leaned forward, his expression earnest. Eli, I've been working undercover for the federal government for 8 months. Everything I've told you about leaving the mountain, about negotiating with the syndicate, I was trying to keep you safe while we built our case. The revelation should have felt like betrayal, but Eli found himself oddly relieved. Jake's recent behavior had seemed so out of character that federal involvement actually made more sense than simple capitulation to corporate pressure. The mining survey you found, Hayes continued, apparently aware of Eli's discovery, is just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The syndicate has been conducting illegal assessments throughout the Bitterroot Range, planning extraction operations. That would violate multiple federal environmental laws. Hope's presence beside his chair reminded Eli that the stakes extended beyond legal technicalities. The syndicate's industrial vision would destroy not just the landscape, but the delicate ecosystem that supported creatures like her. What do you need from me? Eli asked, though he suspected the answer would involve considerable personal risk. We need you to stay. The younger agent spoke for the first time, his voice carrying quiet intensity. The syndicate believes they're close to forcing you off your property. When they make their final move, we'll have the evidence needed to prosecute the entire organization. The plan required Eli to serve as bait in a trap designed to catch much larger prey. His survival would depend on federal agents whose competence and loyalty he couldn't fully assess, while Hope would be exposed to dangers that could prove fatal. There's something else, Jake added reluctantly. The syndicate knows about Hope. They're planning to use her as justification for federal intervention, claiming that harboring dangerous wildlife creates a public safety emergency. The irony was bitter Hope's loyalty and intelligence, the very qualities that had saved Eli's sanity and purpose, would be twisted into evidence against them both. Her existence had become both the reason for fighting and the weapon their enemies would use against them. When? Eli asked simply. Soon, Hayes replied. Our intelligence suggests they're planning a coordinated operation within the next few days. Federal marshals, territorial officials, and syndicate representatives all moving together. Eli looked down at Hope, whose dark eyes seemed to reflect understanding of the approaching danger. She'd grown from helpless cub to formidable companion. But the forces arrayed against them possessed resources and authority that even her remarkable capabilities couldn't overcome through direct confrontation. There's one more thing, Hayes continued, his expression growing more serious. We've discovered that the syndicate has connections to territorial politicians and federal bureaucrats. Some of the people supposedly investigating them are actually working to protect their interests. The corruption extended far beyond simple business fraud, reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. Eli's fight to protect his mountain had become part of a larger struggle between honest law enforcement and systemic criminal conspiracy. So we don't know who to trust, Eli said, understanding the full dimensions of their predicament. We know. We can trust each other, Jake replied firmly. And we know that stopping them here, on your mountain, might be our only chance to prevent them from destroying everything we've spent our lives protecting. As dawn approached through the cabin windows, Eli felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a familiar burden. The mining survey hidden beneath his floorboard represented wealth beyond imagination, but also the destruction of everything he'd learned to value. All right, he said finally, his hand finding Hope's massive head. We'll make our stand here. But I want your word that Hope's safety is part of whatever plan you're cooking up. The federal agents exchanged glances before Hayes nodded gravely. You have our word, Mr. Boone. But you should understand, this isn't going to be easy for any of us. Outside, the mountain peaks caught the first light of dawn, their snow-covered summits glowing like beacons of hope in a world grown suddenly more complex and dangerous than Ella had ever imagined. The military Medal of Honor lay wrapped in Sarah's best silk scarf, hidden in a wooden box beneath their bedroom floorboards, alongside other memories Eli had thought buried forever. He hadn't touched the decoration in 37 years, not since the day he'd returned from the war and sworn to live peacefully among these mountains. Now, as he held the tarnished bronze star up to the lamplight, faces of dead comrades seemed to watch him from the shadows. Never thought I'd need these skills again, he murmured to Hope, who lay watching him with the patient attention she brought to all his activities. Figured I'd left all that violence behind when I came home too. Sarah, the medal felt heavier than he remembered, weighted not just with bronze, but with memories of battles fought in places whose names had been scrubbed from official records. He'd been young then, barely 23, leading reconnaissance missions, deep behind enemy lines where survival depended on reading terrain, predicting human behavior, and making life-or-death decisions with incomplete information. Hope's intelligent eyes seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed in her human companion. Eli's movements had taken on the focused precision of someone preparing for combat, and his attention constantly shifted to windows, doors, and potential approaches to their position. Over the past 3 days, he transformed his peaceful mountain homestead into a tactical fortress that would have impressed his old commanding officers. Natural features provided defensive advantages. The cabin's position on elevated ground, clear fields of fire in multiple directions, and access to escape routes through terrain that would challenge pursuing forces. "Come here, girl," Eli called softly, and Hope padded to his side with silent grace. Time you understood what's coming. He'd been training her systematically, building on her natural intelligence and protective instincts to create signals and responses that might prove crucial in the approaching confrontation. Hope learned with remarkable speed, grasping complex concepts that seemed to transcend normal animal cognition. The hand signals he taught her were based on military fieldcraft silent communication that allowed coordination without revealing positions to enemy forces. Hope had mastered stay, go, quiet, and guard with an understanding that suggested she grasped not just the commands, but their tactical implications. "When I give you this signal," Eli demonstrated a specific hand gesture, "you disappear into the forest and wait for my call. No matter what happens, no matter what you hear, you stay hidden until I come for you." Hope's reluctance was obvious. Her entire being was oriented toward protecting him, and the idea of abandoning him during danger went against every instinct she possessed. But her intelligence allowed her to understand that survival sometimes required painful choices. Martha arrived as the sun reached its zenith, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies and information. Her face carried the grim determination of someone who decided to stand against overwhelming odds, regardless of personal cost. "Federal agents are gathering in town," she reported, unloading ammunition, medical supplies, and preserved foods. "But Jake says some of them might be working for the syndicate. We can't tell the honest ones from the corrupt ones until shooting starts." The uncertainty added another layer of complexity to an already desperate situation. Eli would have to distinguish between legitimate federal officers and syndicate operatives disguised as law enforcement, making split-second decisions that could determine whether he faced justice or murder. "What about the territorial officials?" Eli asked, checking his rifle's action with practiced efficiency. "Governor's office sent a special prosecutor," Martha replied. "Woman named Catherine Walsh, who's supposedly clean. But she's got syndicate lawyers breathing down her neck, claiming you're harboring dangerous wildlife in violation of federal safety regulations." Hope's head lifted at the mention of her status as dangerous wildlife. Her expression seemed almost human in its mixture of confusion and hurt. She'd spent months learning to live peacefully among humans, only to discover that her very existence was considered a threat. Jake Morrison arrived as afternoon shadows began lengthening across the valley. His face carried the strain of someone operating under deep cover while watching friends walk into mortal danger. Federal Marshal Hayes accompanied him, along with 2 additional agents whose loyalties remained uncertain. "They're moving tonight," Jake announced without preamble. Full coordination between territorial marshals, federal agents, and syndicate security personnel. Official operation to remove dangerous wildlife and investigate illegal land use violations. The bureaucratic language couldn't disguise the reality armed men would surround his cabin under color of law, with orders to remove both him and Hope by whatever means necessary. Legal paperwork would provide cover for what amounted to an armed assault on American citizens. "How many?" Eli asked, his mind automatically calculating fields of fire and ammunition requirements. 23 personnel total, Hayes replied, grimly. "But we don't know how many are honest federal agents versus syndicate operatives. Could be half and half, could be worse." Eli studied the federal marshal's face, looking for tells that might indicate deception or hidden loyalties. Hayes seemed genuine, but 37 years of peaceful mountain life had dulled his ability to read potential enemies under pressure. "There's something else," Jake continued reluctantly. They're bringing specialized equipment, tranquilizer, guns, capture nets, and a transport cage designed for large predators. They're planning to take Hope alive. The news should have been encouraging, but Eli understood the implications. A living grizzly would provide better propaganda value than a dead one, proof that dangerous wildlife threatened public safety and justified expanded federal oversight of private property. Where do they plan to take her? Martha asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. Government research facility, Hayes replied. Official story is scientific study of human-animal bonding. Unofficial reality is probably a lifetime in captivity, assuming she survives the capture process. Hope seemed to sense the growing tension, moving closer to Eli's side and pressing her massive bulk against his leg. Her presence provided comfort, but also reminded him of what was at stake, the freedom and dignity of a creature who'd never harmed anyone and whose only crime was loving the wrong human dot. As evening approached, Eli began his final preparations. He'd positioned cached supplies throughout the mountainside, creating fallback positions that would allow sustained resistance even if the cabin fell. His knowledge of local terrain provided advantages that no amount of federal resources could easily overcome. Martha, he said, pressing a sealed envelope into her hands. This is for Thomas in case things don't work out like we're hoping. The letter contained words he'd struggled to write, explanations, apologies, and the kind of love that can only be expressed when time is running out. Thomas needed to understand that his father's final stand wasn't about stubbornness or pride, but about protecting something precious in a world increasingly hostile to beauty and loyalty. You'll give it to him yourself, Martha replied firmly, refusing to accept the possibility of defeat. After this is over and the syndicate's been stopped. Hope had claimed her position by the fireplace, but her attention remained focused on the cabin's approaches. Her senses detected movement long before human eyes could spot it, providing early warning that might mean the difference between successful defense and catastrophic surprise. They're coming, Jake announced, studying the darkening forest through binoculars. I can see movement along the main trail, vehicles and personnel moving into position. Eli checked his weapons one final time, ensuring that each rifle was loaded and positioned for optimal effectiveness. The Medal of Honor rested in his shirt pocket, not as decoration but as reminder of other battles fought for principles larger than personal survival. Remember, Hayes said, his voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement, we need evidence of criminal conspiracy. Let them make the first illegal move before responding with force. The irony was bitter. Eli would have to allow armed men to threaten his home and companion before defending himself, trusting that federal agents of uncertain loyalty would distinguish between justified resistance and criminal violence. Hope, Eli called softly, and a massive bear moved to his side with liquid grace. Whatever happens out there, you remember that you're family. Not property, not livestock, not some wild animal, to be caged and studied. You're family, and family protects each other. Hope's rumbling response seemed to carry understanding that transcended species boundaries. Her dark eyes held intelligence, loyalty, and courage that would have shamed many humans Eli had known. Outside, the mountain night settled over peaks and valleys that had witnessed centuries of struggle between those who would protect and those who would exploit. The approaching confrontation would determine not just the fate of one man and his unusual companion, but the future of a way of life that honored the bond between humans and the wild places that shaped them. Well, girl, Eli said, his hand finding the thick fur of Hope's neck. Time to show these folks what happens when they threaten family. The Medal of Honor in his pocket seemed to pulse with the heartbeats of soldiers who died defending principles they couldn't always articulate but instinctively understood. Tonight, those same principles would be tested again in a mountain cabin where an old man and a young bear prepared to make their stand against forces that measured everything in terms of profit and control. Beyond the cabin windows, lights began, moving through the forest like predatory eyes, and the final chapter of their story prepared to unfold under stars that had watched over these mountains since time immemorial. Sarah's locket rested against Eli's chest as the first shot shattered. The mountain silence, its weight a reminder of everything worth defending. The silver pendant contained photographs from their wedding day, Sarah in her grandmother's dress, himself young and confident, both of them believing love could overcome any obstacle. Now, 39 years later, that faith faced its ultimate test. The syndicate forces had surrounded the cabin with military precision, but they'd underestimated both the terrain and their opponents. Eli's defensive preparations turned the familiar homestead into a fortress that extracted a bloody price for every yard of advancement. Movement on the North Ridge. Jake whispered through the radio, his voice tight with controlled tension. 6. Men with automatic weapons moving to flank your position. Hope lay pressed against the cabin's back wall, her massive form coiled with barely contained energy. Eli's hand signals had taught her to remain hidden during the initial assault, but her dark eyes tracked every sound and movement with predatory intensity. The first wave came from 3 directions. Simultaneously, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm defensive positions through superior numbers and firepower. Muzzle flashes lit the forest like deadly fireflies as bullets splintered logs and shattered windows. Eli's return fire was precise and economical, each shot carefully aimed to disable rather than kill. His military training reasserted itself, with muscle memory that transcended decades of peaceful mountain life. Cover, movement, target acquisition, the deadly dance of combat that he'd hoped never to perform again. Federal agents, cease fire. Marshal Hayes' voice echoed across the mountainside, but the shooting continued unabated. Either his authority was being ignored, or the attacking forces included more syndicate operatives than honest law enforcement. Hope's protective instincts finally overwhelmed her training. When a rifle bullet struck the cabin wall inches from Eli's position, she erupted from concealment with a roar that seemed to shake the mountain itself. Her charge scattered the assault team's left flank, sending armed men scrambling for safety. As 600 pounds of enraged grizzly demolished their tactical formation. "Good girl," Eli called, shifting position to cover Hope's advance. "Show them what family means." The sight of the massive bear protecting her human companion had a profound psychological effect on the attacking forces. Men who'd been trained to face armed resistance found themselves confronting a creature that operated by entirely different rules, one that viewed their weapons as annoyances rather than threats. "Jake," Morrison's voice crackled through the radio, with urgent warning. "Eli, we've got problems. Some of these federal agents are shooting at the real ones. This whole operation's been compromised." The confusion provided tactical advantage, but also increased danger for everyone involved. In the darkness and chaos, distinguishing allies and enemies became nearly impossible, turning the mountainside into a deadly maze where any movement could trigger friendly fire. Hope's intelligence showed itself as she systematically dismantled the syndicate's assault plan. Rather than attacking indiscriminately, she targeted specific threats, men carrying tranquilizer equipment designed to capture her, communications personnel trying to coordinate the attack, and anyone who aimed weapons toward the cabin. "She's protecting the whole perimeter," Martha observed from her observation post, wonder evident in her voice despite the surrounding violence. "That bear's got better tactical sense than most soldiers." Eli's rifle spoke with rhythmic precision, each shot carefully placed to neutralize threats without causing unnecessary casualties. You could see muzzle flashes from positions where federal agents engaged syndicate operatives, the entire operation dissolving into chaos as competing agendas collided violently. The locket against his chest seemed to pulse with Sarah's heartbeat, reminding him that some things transcended immediate survival. Hope's loyalty, the mountain's sanctity, the principle that love could triumph over greed. These were the values, worth defending regardless of personal cost. North Ridge is clear. Hope's deep rumble carried across the mountainside as she returned from neutralizing the flanking attack. Her coat was matted with snow and debris, but her eyes remained alert and focused on protecting their shared territory. The first assault had failed, but Eli knew it was only the beginning. The syndicate had invested too much in this operation to withdraw after initial setbacks. They would regroup, reassess, and return with heavier weapons and different tactics. "Jake," Eli called into his radio, "what's your assessment of friendly versus hostile forces?" The response carried grim news. "Maybe half the federal personnel are legitimate. The rest are syndicate operatives with fake credentials. We're fighting a shadow war where uniforms don't mean anything." Hope positioned herself protectively between the cabin and the most likely avenue of attack, her massive form silhouetted against the mountain stars. Her presence had transformed a simple property dispute into something approaching legend. The story of a man and bear who refused to surrender their home to corporate greed. As temporary silence settled over the mountainside, Eli reloaded his weapons and prepared for the next assault. The syndicate would return with greater force and fewer scruples, but they would also face defenders whose bond transcended species and whose commitment to protecting each other had been tested in the crucible of combat. The locket against his chest carried Sarah's blessing. Hope's loyalty provided strength, and the mountain itself seemed to gather around them like an ancient fortress preparing for siege. Whatever came next, they would face it together, family defending family against forces that measured everything in terms of profit and control. The dynamite from his father's old mining claim lay cached beneath the cabin's floorboards. 3 sticks of aged explosive that represented the last resort of a desperate man. Eli had hoped never to use them, but the syndicate's second assault came with overwhelming force and ruthless intent. The time for half measures had passed. "There, bringing up heavy equipment." Jake's voice crackled through static-filled radio transmission. "Armored vehicles and what looks like military-grade weapons. This isn't law enforcement anymore. It's an invasion." Hope sensed the escalating danger before human ears detected the approaching engines. Her massive head lifted from the cabin floor, dark eyes fixed on the forest with predatory intensity. The rumbling growl that emerged from her chest carried a warning that transcended species. Something that belonged to the mountain was preparing to defend its territory. "Easy, girl," Eli whispered, checking the detonator wires he'd rigged to protect the cave entrance. "We're going to make them pay a price they never expected." The syndicate had abandoned all pretense of legal procedure. Searchlights swept the mountainside like mechanical eyes, while armored vehicles churned up terrain that had remained undisturbed for decades. Their industrial approach to warfare violated every principle that had governed life in these mountains since the first settlers arrived. Federal. Marshal Hayes appeared at the cabin's back door, his face grim with the knowledge of betrayal. "Eli, we've lost contact with honest federal forces. The syndicate's people have taken control of the operation. They're not planning to arrest you. They're planning to eliminate you." The news confirmed what Eli had suspected since the shooting began. This wasn't about law enforcement or public safety. It was about removing obstacles to mineral extraction worth millions of dollars. His death would be blamed on resisting arrest, while Hope would be shot as a dangerous animal protecting her. "Hambler, Martha's safe," Hayes continued. "We got her out when the shooting started, but they've got us surrounded with superior numbers and equipment." Hope moved to Eli's side, her massive bulk providing both comfort and reminder of what was at stake. Her loyalty had never wavered, even when faced with weapons and enemies she couldn't fully understand. That absolute trust deserved protection. regardless of personal cost. The final assault began with mechanized, precision-armored vehicles advancing from multiple directions, while men with automatic weapons provided covering fire. The Syndicate had brought sufficient force to overwhelm any conventional defense, but they hadn't anticipated the mountain itself joining the fight. "Now, Hope!" Eli shouted, triggering the first detonator. The explosion collapsed the cave entrance in a thunder of falling stone that sealed the mineral deposits beneath tons of granite. The Syndicate's investment in geological surveys and extraction planning vanished in seconds, buried under an avalanche that would take years to clear. Hope's roar of triumph echoed across the mountainside as she charged toward the nearest armored vehicle, her claws striking sparks from steel plating. The sight of 600 pounds of enraged grizzly attacking military equipment sent shockwaves through the assault force that no amount of training could have prepared them for. Jake Morrison emerged from concealment with 3 legitimate federal agents, their weapons trained on Syndicate operatives who had shed all pretense of legal authority. "Federal agents, lay down your weapons. You're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder." The mountain battlefield dissolved into chaos as competing forces engaged in close quarters combat among the pines and granite outcroppings. Eli's knowledge of local terrain allowed him to move like a ghost between positions, striking at targets of opportunity while Hope disrupted enemy formations with devastating effectiveness. "The evidence," Hayes called out, pointing toward Harrison Caldwell as the Syndicate leader attempted to escape with documents that would implicate his organization. "Don't let him destroy the proof." Hope intercepted Caldwell's retreat with the fluid grace of a natural predator, her massive form blocking his path to the waiting helicopter. The Syndicate leader found himself face to face with the creature he planned to cage or kill, her dark eyes reflecting an intelligence that promised judgment for his crimes against her family. Eli's final shot disabled the helicopter's engine, grounding the aircraft and eliminating the Syndicate's escape route. The smoking wreckage represented more than mechanical failure. It symbolized the destruction of dreams built on exploitation and environmental destruction. As dawn approached through the gunsmoke and settling dust, the surviving Syndicate operatives found themselves surrounded by federal agents whose loyalty had never been in question. The mountain had claimed its victory, but at a cost that would be measured in more than casualties. "It's over," Hayes announced, his voice carrying exhaustion and relief. "We've got enough evidence to prosecute the entire organization. Their mining operation is finished." Hope returned to Eli's side, her massive form bearing scratches and debris from the night's combat, but her eyes held the satisfaction of a job completed, family protected, territory defended, and enemies defeated through courage and determination. The dynamite blast had sealed more than mineral deposits. It had closed a chapter of exploitation that threatened everything these mountains represented. The Syndicate's industrial vision lay buried beneath granite and granite, preserved for future generations who might understand the difference between wealth and value. As federal agents secured the scene and arrested the surviving conspirators, Eli felt Sarah's locket against his chest, its weight now carrying triumph rather than desperate hope. The mountain had been defended. Hope had proven her loyalty beyond all doubt, and sometimes the good guys actually won. The new wooden cross stood beside Sarah's grave on the ridge above the cabin, its carefully crafted surface gleaming with fresh pine sap and blessed with hope instead of grief. Unlike the dozens of crosses Eli had carved during his darkest months, this one celebrated renewal rather than mourning loss. Hope lay beside him in the morning sunshine, her massive form relaxed and content as mountain breezes carried the scent of wildflowers across the peaceful valley. 6 months had passed since the night the Syndicate's dreams died in gunfire and falling stone. The federal prosecution had been swift and thorough. Harrison Caldwell and his co-conspirators faced decades in prison for conspiracy, fraud, environmental crimes, and attempted murder. The mining surveys and extraction plans lay sealed in evidence. Lockers, their destructive potential neutralized by justice and the mountain's own defenses. "Thomas is coming home today," Eli said to Hope, scratching behind her ears with the gentle affection that had become their morning ritual. "Been 3 years since I've seen the boy. Wonder if he'll remember how to live up here." Hope's rumbling response suggested approval, though she'd never met the son whose departure had contributed to Eli's spiral into grief and isolation. Her intelligence had grown along with her physical development, and she seemed to understand that Thomas's return represented healing for wounds that preceded her arrival. The reunion had been Martha's doing, though she'd worked through intermediaries to avoid seeming manipulative. Word of Eli's heroic stand against corporate corruption had reached the railroad camps, where Thomas had read newspaper accounts of his father's transformation from broken widower to mountain legend. The stories described a man Thomas barely recognized, confident, purposeful, and bonded to a grizzly bear whose loyalty had become the stuff of frontier mythology. "Figured you'd be dead by now," had been Thomas's first words when he'd called from the train station in Missoula, or locked up for keeping dangerous wildlife without permits. "Hope's got all her papers now," Eli had replied, unable to suppress his grin. "Federal wildlife sanctuary status, thanks to some sympathetic bureaucrats who appreciate what she did for law enforcement." The sanctuary designation had been Jake Morrison's suggestion, supported by Federal Marshal Hayes and approved by territorial officials eager to associate themselves with the syndicate's defeat. Hope's intelligence and loyalty had impressed everyone who'd witnessed her tactical effectiveness during the mountain battle, leading to official recognition that she was no ordinary wild animal. Now, as Eli watched the trail that led up from the valley, he felt the nervous anticipation of a father preparing to meet the son he'd failed to understand. Thomas had grown into manhood during his absence, shaped by experiences that Eli could only imagine. The young man who stepped off the afternoon train would be different from the boy who'd left 3 years earlier, just as Eli himself had been, transformed by grief, loss, and unexpected redemption. There, Hope's alert posture indicated approaching visitors before Eli's aging eyes could spot them. That'll be Thomas, and likely Martha too, knowing her. The small party that emerged from the forest included Thomas, Martha, and Jake Morrison, who'd appointed himself unofficial guardian of the reunion. Thomas had grown taller and broader, his face weathered by outdoor work and marked with the quiet confidence of someone who'd found his place in the world. Hope evaluated the newcomers with her characteristic intelligence, recognizing Martha and Jake as trusted friends, but focusing her attention on the stranger whose scent and mannerisms identified him as family. Her approach was cautious but friendly, allowing Thomas to appreciate her magnificent size and obvious intelligence without feeling threatened. "Sweet Jesus," Thomas whispered, extending his hand for Hope to investigate. The stories didn't do her justice. "She's beautiful." The simple acceptance in his son's voice brought tears to Eli's eyes. Thomas had inherited Sarah's ability to see beauty where others perceived only danger, recognizing Hope's essential nature despite her formidable appearance. "She saved my life," Eli said simply. "Not just from the syndicate, but from myself. Gave me something to protect when I'd forgotten how to hope." Thomas studied his father with eyes that carried Sarah's intelligence and empathy. "Maybe she saved us both. I was so angry when I left, angry at you, at Ma's death, at everything these mountains represented. But reading about what happened here, seeing what you two accomplished together, it reminded me that some things are worth fighting for." The reconciliation unfolded gradually over the following weeks as father and son rebuilt their relationship around shared respect rather than childhood dependencies. Thomas had learned valuable skills during his time with the railroad, but he'd also discovered that his heart remained tied to the mountains that had shaped his youth. Hope served as bridge between them, her presence providing common ground for conversations that might otherwise have remained difficult. She'd adopted Thomas with the same protective loyalty she'd shown Eli, recognizing him as family despite their lack of shared history. "We're thinking about expanding," Eli told Martha during one of her weekly visits. "Thomas has ideas about sustainable logging, selective harvesting that works with the forest instead of against it. Hope's sanctuary status provides federal protection, but we can still make a living here." The sanctuary had become a destination for researchers studying human-animal bonding, wildlife rehabilitation, and sustainable resource management. Hope's story had captured public imagination, transforming her from dangerous wildlife into a symbol of loyalty and intelligence that transcended species. Boundaries dot as autumn painted the mountainsides in gold and crimson. Eli found himself surrounded by family both old and new. Hope had given birth to twin cubs, their playful antics filling the cabin with laughter that echoed Sarah's memory without diminishing it. Thomas had built his own cabin nearby, close enough for cooperation but far enough for independence. The wooden cross on the ridge caught the setting sun's light, its polished surface reflecting hope instead of sorrow. Below, the valley stretched toward peaks that would outlast human ambitions and corporate dreams, protected now by bonds of love that proved stronger than greed. Hope's deep rumble of contentment seemed to approve of the peaceful scene family, gathered around the fire, plans made for tomorrow, and the mountain's ancient rhythms undisturbed by forces that measured everything in terms of profit rather than value. Some battles were worth fighting, not because victory was certain, but because defeat was unthinkable.